The morning it happened, I had been making tea, not because I was thirsty particularly. It was just what I did at 8:30. Put the kettle on, take out the blue mug my late husband had brought back from a trip to Nova Scotia, and sit by the kitchen window while the light came through the curtains. That was mine. That corner, that light, that mug. 26 years of it. I didn't hear my son-in-law come downstairs. He moved quietly for a large man, which I had always found unsettling in a way I could never quite explain to my daughter. He walked past me without saying good morning, opened the fridge, stood there with the door hanging wide, letting the cold out, the way he always did. Then he turned around and said, as though he were telling me the weather, "We need the kitchen table for my equipment today. You'll have to eat somewhere else." I looked at him. I looked at my mug, still steaming. I looked at my kitchen table, the one my husband and I had bought at an estate sale in Guelph back in 1998, the one with the small burn mark near the left corner from a candle that tipped over the Christmas my daughter was 7 years old. "I'm having my tea," I said. He shrugged and started pulling his things out of a bag he'd left by the door. A second monitor, cables, some kind of microphone stand he was setting up in my kitchen, at my table, and he did not look at me once while he did it. I finished my tea standing at the counter. "I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a dramatic person. I am 68 years old. I taught English at a secondary school in Hamilton for 31 years. I have sat through staff meetings that could have been emails. I have marked 7,000 essays. I have buried a husband and a mother and a brother-in-law, and I have not once in my adult life made a scene in a public place. I am the kind of woman who returns library books 2 days early and still apologizes for the inconvenience. So when I say that what happened over the following weeks was the worst I have ever felt in my own home, I need you to understand that I do not say that easily. My daughter, I'll call her by the nickname her father gave her, Birdie, had been living with me for 2 years. She came back after the first lockdown, when her and her husband's lease in Toronto ran out, and they decided, along with what seemed like half the country, that they could work remotely. The plan was to stay 6 months, save money, get back on their feet after a rough patch. That was in 2022. It was now the spring of 2024. Her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law because I have no other name that feels right, had a job in digital marketing that he did from a laptop. He billed clients, held video calls, sent invoices. He was not unsuccessful exactly. He was just unwilling. Unwilling to look for an apartment when the market was hard. Unwilling to pay the kind of rent that Toronto demanded. Unwilling, as far as I could tell, to be uncomfortable in any way that he hadn't personally chosen. Birdie worked part-time from home, too, at a remote administrative job she'd taken when we were all still uncertain about the world. She was kind. She helped with groceries sometimes. She noticed when the recycling needed to go out. Her husband did not notice any of those things. He ate what was in the fridge without asking. He took the parking spot in the driveway, mine, the one closer to the door, the one I used because my hip has been giving me trouble since the fall of 2021, and when I mentioned it, he smiled and said he needed it for an early call. That was in October. By February, the car was still there every morning, and the early calls had apparently become permanent. I said nothing. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Birdie needed time. I told myself that the kindest thing I could do was give them space to figure things out without an old woman making everything harder. I was wrong about what kindness required of me. The kitchen table incident was a Tuesday. The following Saturday he had friends over, 3 men I had never met, who arrived at 7 in the evening with beer and stayed until past midnight, loudly in my living room, while I lay awake upstairs listening to the television at a volume that made my walls feel thin. I came downstairs once to get a glass of water. One of the men looked at me and said something to the others, and they laughed. I don't know what he said. I didn't ask. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I thought about my husband. He had been a quiet man, private and steady, and he had loved this house with the particular devotion of someone who had not grown up with much. He painted the trim himself every 5 years. He fixed the back fence 3 times. He planted the lilac bush by the side gate because I had mentioned once, years before, that I liked the smell. The lilac still bloomed every May. I thought, sitting there in the dark, that he would have hated what this house had become. Not because of noise or inconvenience, because of the feeling, the way a home stops feeling like yours when you're no longer sure you're allowed to be in it. On a Tuesday evening in March, I came home from a walk. I walk every evening, 40 minutes, doctor's orders for my blood pressure, and found that my son-in-law had moved the small table I kept by the front door. It was the table where I put my keys, my bag, my gloves in winter. It had been there for 15 years. He had moved it to the corner near the coat closet to make more room in the entryway, he said, because it felt cluttered. He did not ask me. He simply moved it. I put my keys in my coat pocket. I went to the kitchen. I made dinner, but something had shifted in me quietly, the way ice shifts before it breaks. Nothing visible on the surface, everything moving underneath. I called my friend Philippa that night. Philippa and I have been friends since our first year of Teachers College, which puts us at over 40 years. She is the kind of person who listens without interrupting and then says the one thing you needed to hear. I told her about the table, about the parking spot, about the men and their midnight television and the laughter in the kitchen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elaine, how long are you going to let this go on?" I didn't have an answer. "You know you don't have to be this accommodating," she said. "She's your daughter, not a tenant. But him, he doesn't have any claim on your house, none at all." I knew she was right. I had known for months. But there is a distance between knowing something and being ready to act on it, and I had been standing at that distance for a long time. "I wouldn't even know where to start," I said. "Start with a lawyer," Philippa said. "That's always where you start." I had a name. A woman I'd seen years ago from my husband's estate who had moved into a small practice that handled family and property law. I still had her card somewhere. I found it in the bottom of my desk drawer on a Wednesday morning, between a takeout menu from a restaurant that no longer existed and a birthday card from my mother, who had been gone 11 years. I held the card for a long time before I picked up the phone. Her name was Anita. She remembered me. She was warm and specific in the way that good professionals often are. She asked about the house, the ownership, the arrangement, how long they'd been there, whether anything had been put in writing. Nothing had been put in writing. Of course it hadn't. It was my daughter. We didn't think we needed paper. Anita explained things to me in plain language. In Ontario, if someone has been living in your home for a significant period without a formal lease, you can still ask them to leave, but you need to do it properly, with notice, documented and delivered. It was not as simple as saying, "Go," but it was also not complicated. It just required intention. It required me to stop waiting and decide. "Do you want to ask them to leave?" she said. I looked out my kitchen window. The lilac bush hadn't bloomed yet. It was still too early in the year, just the bare gray branches and the first small hints of green at the tips. "Yes," I said, "I do." She told me what to send. A formal letter delivered in writing giving adequate notice. 60 days was appropriate, given the circumstances. She would help me draft it. She told me to make sure I delivered it in a way I could document, in person, with a witness, or sent with tracking if by mail. She told me not to argue, not to explain, not to soften it with conversation. The document would say what needed to be said. I wrote the letter with Anita's help over the phone that afternoon. Then I printed it. 2 copies. Bertie was at a friend's place that evening. My son-in-law was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, reheating something in the microwave. I waited until he turned around. I held out the envelope. He looked at it. He looked at me. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "It's a letter," I said. "You'll want to read it." He didn't take it immediately. He stood there with his arms crossed, the way he did when he was deciding how much authority he had in the room. And then something in my face must have told him that the room had changed, because he took the envelope. He read it, standing at the counter. I watched his expression move through several things: confusion, then disbelief, then something hard and cold. "You can't do this," he said. "I can," I said. "I have. This is Bertie's home, too." "Bertie is my daughter," I said. "This is my house. There's a difference." He said a few more things after that. He raised his voice. He used the word unbelievable several times. He said I was dividing the family, that I was choosing a house over my own child, that I would regret this. I stood in the doorway and let him finish. I had decided before I came downstairs that I would not argue. Anita had told me there was nothing to argue. The letter said what it said. When he stopped, I said, "I'll leave the second copy on the table. You might want it for your records." Then I went back upstairs. I won't pretend that was easy. I sat on my bed for a long time afterward, and I was shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of having held something back for so long and finally letting it out. My hands wouldn't settle. I made myself breathe slowly, the way I'd learned years ago when I was dealing with my husband's illness, that slow, measured breathing that doesn't fix anything but keeps you present. Bertie called me 20 minutes later. Her voice was tight. She had talked to her husband, clearly. She wanted to know if it was true. I told her it was. She cried. She asked me why I hadn't talked to her first, and I told her that I had tried in various ways for many months, and she hadn't been ready to hear it. That was true, though I said it as gently as I could. "Where are we supposed to go?" she said. "That's something you'll need to work out," I said. "You have 60 days. That's enough time." "Mom, Bertie." I kept my voice steady. "I love you. I am not punishing you, but this is my home, and I need it back." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she needed time to think. I said that was fine, and I meant it. The weeks that followed were not comfortable. My son-in-law became very still and deliberate in the way he moved through the house, a different kind of unpleasant than before. More watchful. He stopped eating the food in my fridge. He stopped speaking to me directly. He communicated through silence the way some people use volume, methodically and with intent. Bertie went back and forth. Some days she was sad and quiet, sitting in the kitchen while I made dinner, and we talked a little about small things. The neighbor's new dog, a television program she'd started watching, whether the lilac bush was going to bloom early this year. Other days she was cooler with me, aligned with her husband in a way that put distance between us. I let it happen. I didn't push. I had done what I needed to do, and now there was just time to get through. Philippa came over one Saturday and we sat on the back porch with coffee, even though it was still too cold, really, wrapped in our coats, and she told me I was doing the right thing. I didn't need her to tell me, but it helped to hear it from someone who had known me long enough to mean it. On the 53rd day of the 60, they moved out. I watched from the upstairs window, not to gloat, not to verify, but because I didn't quite know what to do with myself that morning, and the window was where I ended up. A moving truck, small, a rental from somewhere downtown. 3 trips between the truck and the front door. My son-in-law carried boxes without looking up. Bertie, on her last trip out, paused on the front step and looked back at the house for a moment. I didn't know if she was looking for me. I stepped back from the window. She called me 3 weeks later. She had found a place in Kitchener, a 2-bedroom, reasonable rent, close to her job. She sounded tired but not angry. She asked if she could come for Sunday dinner sometime without her husband. I said yes, of course. I had never said anything else. The first Sunday she came, I made roast chicken. She sat at the kitchen table, my table, with its burn mark from that long ago Christmas candle, and she looked around the kitchen for a moment in a way I recognized, the way you look at something you've taken for granted and are only now really seeing. "It feels different in here," she said. "Does it?" I said. "Quieter." She paused. "But good quiet." I didn't say anything to that. I just put the chicken on the table and sat down across from her, and we ate together the way we used to before everything got complicated. There is something I want to say, and I want to say it carefully, because I know that some of you listening are in situations that look like mine, and I know how long it can take to see clearly when love is involved. I blamed myself for a long time. I thought that if I had been firmer earlier, at 6 months, at 12 months, in the first week when he took my parking spot and I said nothing, none of it would have reached the point it did. And there is truth in that. I did allow too much. I told myself I was being kind when I was actually being afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of my daughter's disappointment, afraid of being the difficult one. We teach people how to treat us. That is not a cliche. That is one of the most accurate things I know about being human. But I also want to say this: it is never too late to change what you're teaching. I was 68 years old when I picked up the phone and called Anita. I was 68 years old when I stood in my own doorway and handed over that envelope without raising my voice. I was 68 years old when I learned that dignity is not something that runs out. It just sometimes needs to be reclaimed. My lilac bush bloomed in May, as it always does. I went out one morning and cut a small branch and brought it inside and put it in a glass on the kitchen windowsill, right beside the blue mug from Nova Scotia. The smell filled the whole corner of the room. It smelled like mine. And that, after everything, was enough. I have thought about that Tuesday morning many times since, the morning I stood at my own kitchen counter drinking my tea because a man who paid nothing toward this house had decided he needed the table. I've thought about why I didn't say more, why I finished my tea and put the mug in the sink and went about my day as though nothing had happened. The honest answer is that I had been practicing that kind of silence for 2 years. Each time I said nothing about the parking spot, about the fridge, about the noise. I was teaching him that there were no limits, not because I was foolish, because I was afraid of what saying something would cost me. I was afraid of what saying something would cost me. I was afraid of being the one who made everything harder. So I kept quiet, and the quiet cost me more than speaking would have. That is the part I want you to sit with, if any of this sounds familiar. The things we allow, we eventually have to undo. And undoing them is harder than the original boundary would have been, because now there is history and resentment, and the other person's genuine surprise that you mean it this time. My son-in-law was not entirely wrong to be shocked when I handed him that envelope. I had spent 2 years telling him without words that this was acceptable. The letter was the first honest thing I had communicated to him in a very long time. What I understand now, standing on the other side of it, is that protecting your own dignity is not a selfish act. It is, in fact, the most responsible thing you can do in a household, because when you abandon it, everything else in that space eventually bends around the absence of it. The tone of a home follows the person who is willing to hold the line. When I stopped holding the line, someone else filled that space, and he filled it badly. Bertie came for Sunday dinner last month. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one, and she told me she had been talking to someone, a counselor, working through some of what the last 2 years had been. She said it quietly, not as an announcement. I told her I was glad. I didn't tell her how relieved I was, how much I had worried about what she was absorbing from that marriage, from that dynamic, from watching her mother shrink in her own kitchen. What I know about intelligence, real intelligence, not the kind measured in grades or credentials, is that it is mostly the willingness to look clearly at a situation and tell the truth about it. I was not willing to do that for too long. I told myself comfortable stories, that it would resolve on its own, that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. It wasn't. Keeping the peace was only keeping the appearance of peace, and appearances have a way of becoming very expensive over time. And courage, the kind that actually matters in ordinary life, is rarely dramatic. It doesn't look like a confrontation. It looked like me, 68 years old, standing at a kitchen counter, picking up the phone and dialing a number I'd kept in a drawer for years. That was all. One phone call, one printed letter, two copies. You don't have to be young to begin again. You don't have to be unafraid. You just have to be willing, finally, to tell the truth about what you need. My lilac bush bloomed again this May. I cut a branch and put it in a glass by the window. Philippa came over, and we drank our coffee on the back porch in the cold, the way we always have, and she said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. That is what peace actually feels like, not the absence of difficulty, just the absence of bracing yourself.